Welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Adev-Jones, and with my colleagues Fadia Daka and Sabine Schmidt-Loaf, we are the co-conveners of the ESREA STREAM Network. We are happy to welcome you today for this fourth session of our 2024 Research Symposium series on spaces and times of transitions. This session is dedicated to the theme Transgression and Transition, and we have the pleasure today to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Heila Lotz-Sisitka. Heila is a distinguished professor of education and holds a Tier 1 South African National Research Foundation, Department of Science and Technology Chair in Global Change and Social Learning Systems at Rhodes University in South Africa. She is director of the Environmental Learning Research Center, and her research focuses on transformative social learning and green skills learning pathways in areas of biodiversity, the water-food nexus, climate change, social and environmental justice, and just sustainability transitions. On a personal note, I've known Heila for 2 years now, as we are both collaborating in a research program funded by the British Academy titled The Temporalities of a Just Transition, and I'm particularly happy that she accepted our invitation as I measure how much she has to bring to this community. Heila, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and we're impatient to listen to you. You have the mic.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that lovely welcome, and it's such a pleasure to be here, with here being in Makanda, South Africa. Okay, so I've been asked to talk this afternoon on this topic of transgression and transitions. And I thought that what I would do is try to bring some perspectives on a research program that we've been working on for quite a number of years now, and try to share with you how I think some parts of the evolution of this research program, but also that some of the thinking that's been going on inside it. And to introduce myself a little bit more, I feel like I need to show you this map of Africa and the little star at the bottom, because that's where our research center is based, sort of in the Southern African region, South Africa, near the coast. And most of the scholars that we work with are coming from across the continents, across the African continent. And many of them are working with quite a range of very complex social, ecological issues, environmental issues, sustainability issues, from, you know, the issue of DDT being used for malaria control, to sustainable food production systems, to land degradation, to droughts and waste, and many, many other things. So the program, why I'm doing this is I'm just trying to contextualize a little bit the work that I do, because so much of it is so grounded. I was saying to Michelle, I'm not sure that I can offer a very theoretical seminar, because we work in such a grounded way here, and it's so difficult to disconnect theory from the context. So I just wanted to say that as I start, and then I'll kind of unfold how I go with that as I unfold the session. So it's very important for me to just be clear about where I speak from always, I find. Yeah, and so the challenge that we faced with here is how to develop scholarship of teaching and learning when the ontological contexts are so diverse. They're also rapidly transforming, and they're also impacting daily on people's lives and their livelihoods. So we are dealing with what I would call low-level crisis conditions within the much larger geo-historical crisis of colonial modernity and its aftermaths. And so where does one start with, you know, this kind of work in such a context? And of course, we're all facing this enormous challenge. It's a global challenge, but in our region, the challenges associated with climate change are quite severe, because this particular region is warming twice as much as the rest of the world. So while the rest of the world is trying to hold temperatures below 1.5 or 2 degrees, we are already heading in that direction. And when the world gets to 2 degrees, we will be 4 degrees. So we are facing a very enormous challenge in the Southern African region. And so the question that we ask ourselves here is, you know, what kind of learning and agency for adaptation do we need to develop in order to engage with these kinds of questions? And of course, I think everybody knows that these questions are not just local, they're global questions, and they manifest very differently in different places. And on the African continent, we are being said to be on the front line of climate change, highly vulnerable, and we're experiencing a lot of challenges already around drought, water security, and so on. But these challenges are not just a problem of climate change. They're actually intersecting political, economic, ecological, they're humanitarian problems, they're food problems, water problems, land problems, energy, and social justice challenges. So it is a challenging space in which we are working and trying to work and trying to think, you know, the spaces, times, and rhythms, if you like, of adult education, but actually all education, because we work across not only with adult education, but also into the formal education system, into the Tibet structures, and into the whole education and training system, actually. And of course, I think just in general, you know, the climate crisis is one focus of what's going on, but I think in general, these are quite extraordinary times that we are in, and we are seeing, you know, a confluence of many different things, and particularly sort of struggle and failure, if I could say, across the world for the world's majority people and future generations, because the history of nature-culture dualism is leaving the world heating up. The borders are closing in. The governments are becoming more right-wing and more violent. And we are also dealing with, you know, globalized capital, which is extending its reach to replace humans with biotech and machines. So there are many, many different dimensions to the current situation. And while all of this is going on, we're also suddenly starting to come to realize that everything is connected and there is no planet B. We only have this particular planet. And it's been very interesting for me. I've been following this particular movement. I think it's an extraordinary movement, this young people in schools that are responding with these extraordinary levels of agency, and in a very, very rapid period and in a very connected way. And this is quite a very interesting indication of, you know, how this sort of, I guess, the system of communication and possibility is also shifting. And so it's very interesting. It's a sort of shift in spatiality. It's more pluralized. The imaginaries are omnipresent. And there's also the locally bound activity. So you're getting a whole new configuration, I think, of what is possible and how things can be and become possible. These are young children in one of our towns here saying, "On soek die water," which is we are looking for water, because so many of our towns are actually without water. And while this is going on, our education systems, I think, are still very constrained in their logics of learning and also their curriculum metaphors. We've seen a dominance of acquisition metaphors, participation metaphors coming in. And then we get in our field, and I saw my friend Yepe there, education about sustainable development, which is basically a knowledge story, education in the environment, which is an experiential story, and education for sustainable development, which is often more of a values-based and to some extent a political story. But I still feel that there's much more work that needs to be done to, you know, develop the possibilities for education, not only in adult education, but also in formal schooling and all the parts, actually, if you could say, of the education and training system. And then the other challenge that we have is that when we are thinking about the 21st knowledge and learning theory boom that people talk about, you know, so much has been produced, that most of this production has been produced in particular parts of the world. And you can see this picture here, you know, it's a kind of knowledge production map, where most of the knowledge that is being produced about learning and how learning should be constituted and so on, transitions should be managed and so on, is being produced not here. It's actually being produced mostly in the global north, as you can see there. And yet at the same time, we are having these kinds of problems. This is the picture of no water access. So there seems to be a bit of a disjuncture between the types of challenges and where the knowledges are being produced. So it feels to me like we need to do much more work, also bringing in epistemologies of the South. Of course, the work of Susa Santos, very helpful for us to think that through in, I guess, more transgressive ways. And then also to open up this question, the vitality of transgressive learning, what does it look like? How do we constitute it? Why is it becoming so interesting to so many young people on where I'm working? It's been an incredible experience to see how many young people are just drawn to this particular concept and really want to get engaged with it and begin to think different ways of learning and how to think about learning in the current situation that we're in. So that's the kind of work. And of course, it's a challenging job because we've got a double conundrum here, because the language that we need in order to, work on questions of learning is constrained by the fact that, it's already shaped by the culturally and historically specific understandings of learning that have been developed. So it's like you're working with old discourse in order to do something new. And, it's such a brilliant quote, I think, by Harry Daniels. And then D'Souza Santos on the other side tells us about that the history of knowledge and education is based on abyssal thinking, which is essentially, left out the knowledges and thoughts and ways of being of the majority of the world's people as we produced a particular form of thinking about education. And he even talks about epistemicide. He uses such a sort of strong word to indicate this particular problem. And then he says that we've got strong questions with weak answers, and we have got too few people involved in the answering of the question. And so his call is really for a much wider ecologies of knowledge and how to bring that then into education in the kind of space that I'm talking about now is a big challenge, I think. And I took a few years ago, we were discussing this a lot in our research community, and we took some, sort of strength, if I can call it that, with the idea of let's start with the courage of transgression, and let's not be afraid to, think out of the norm of the system, and let's think into different spaces and then do that work and try to do it well. So Lewis Gordon, who's a very well-known decolonial theorist, he suggests that we need a form of leadership and learning that involves serious and substantive meditation on and cultivation of maturity, how to negotiate, live, and transform a world of contradictions, paradoxes, uncertainty, and unfairness. And this little picture here at the bottom is just came through from the recent floods that we had in KwaZulu-Natal here in South Africa. So we've been trying to do this project for quite a number of years now, talk about it, and that is to try to investigate what we then call T-learning, because we wanted to keep the concept of T open, because it carries, transformative education, people talking about transgressive learning, people talking about transdisciplinary learning, and so on. So we wanted to keep the concept open and try to understand the connections between these different, ways of thinking about learning in these kind of transforming times. And of course, this work is being done in the context of transitions to sustainability. So I want to pick up now on the transitions concept a little bit, because it's in the middle of this transitions concept that I think I started to find the space to develop the work on transgressive learning. So transitions, I think you've discussed it quite a lot already. Unfortunately, I missed the first session, but of course it's a very rich concept and there's many dimensions to it. So I sort of just thought I'd start here with this piece from Mary Douglas's work, and she talks about transitions are always at some level about death and rebirth, the demise of boyhood and the beginning of manhood, from girl to woman, from single to married, working to retired, child to citizen, and so on. And I think we're all very familiar with these kind of transitions that happen to all of us throughout the life course or throughout our lives and so on. And then she says this, which I think is very interesting. And of course, there's a lot more to this little statement, but I just thought I'd bring it to the surface here because I think it opens up the interesting space and the need to think well into the middle of a transition and what's going on there. So she says that danger lies in transitional states, simply because transition is neither one state nor the next, and it's undefinable. So there's this sort of big open space in the process of transitioning, which is quite uncertain, undefinable, and she calls it dangerous. And I'll come back to that as I go along. And these little pictures are from a particular transitioning ceremony that young men undergo here in South Africa. And we also have, exactly what she was writing about, where many young men actually die as a result of this sort of space here when it's not actually well carried in the community. So it's been in the news a lot, and there's a lot of this kind of thing. And I think one finds this sort of thing pretty much everywhere. But if you go to just a sort of more generic kind of way of thinking about transition, it also carries its own beauty. If you think about the way in which a butterfly emerges, that's a very well-known transitioning process and transformation process. And then if you think about sustainability transitions, which is what I really want to focus on a little bit more, because I think these are incredibly important to all of us. And I feel at times we're not giving enough thought to them and what they actually are all about, because they tend to get into government speak so quickly and then become these sort of management programs, which I'll also talk about just now. So these are quite complex processes of change, and because they are actually transforming established rules, norms, physical infrastructure, and many other aspects of the socio-technical systems, and there's a big shift going on there towards more sustainable practices, many of which we don't even know how to establish, and yet we know we need to do that, so it's that sort of open space that was talked about earlier. And of course, there's many examples. The ones that are most visible in our societies these days are the ones transitions to renewable energy, or the shift from the combustion engine to electric motors. I read the other day that the electric motor is the only one that has reached the target for the energy transition targets. All other things are not yet on target, in fact, far behind. And so this transition that we are actually faced with is it's a big transition, actually. It's a big transition for human society as a whole. And so it's often very difficult to think into it because you sort of know it, and it's in the news, and code red for humanity. We hear that the climate crisis, it's inevitable, it's unprecedented, it's irreversible, and you see this kind of thing all of the time. So it is complex, and it is going to need rapid and far-reaching transitions. But the thing that is very important to raise, and this is, I think, where I've been focusing my attention in the last sort of number of years, is that these transitions in themselves do not automatically guarantee the creation of more equitable systems. And so there's a sort of a liminal space to link up to some of the previous discussion on liminality, where justice needs to be worked out under new conditions. And that's, I guess, the important touch point that I want to pick up on. And there's many models of these sustainability transitions. This is one that's very well used in the environmental sciences. It's called the multi-level framework, and it talks about transformations at the niche level, and then transformations at the regime level, and then at the landscape level. So if you get something like climate change, it puts pressure on the regime level, which is where your policies and technologies and science systems and so on are functioning, and the niche level is really your smaller networks of actors. And so there's this kind of like graphic identification of this transitioning process, a very, very widely used model. And it's particularly been used for socio-technical transitions. And you can see there it's got a kind of temporality built into it. And it's also got a kind of level of sort of levels, if you like, built into it. And so there's been a lot of discussion and debate around this particular way of thinking about these transitions. And in the discussion at the moment there's much more talk about power and political economy as it kind of comes to play itself out in these transitions. There's also a lot more talk about cultural meanings of transitions and sustainability transitions, and you can approach them from very different vantage points, different cultural meanings. And then the one that is very big, certainly in our context at the moment, is the issue of justice in the transition. And so we've got a whole big process and discourse about just transitions that's been emerging, which I'll talk a bit about as well. And then there's also new work that's emerging to try and look at the flip side of these innovations, what's being destabilized and what's declining, what's falling out in the decline of coal industries, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also a discussion about more sophisticated research on different policy mixes, and then differentiation of different distinct transition pathways, so not all transition pathways are the same. And so I think these sort of generic models also end up being inadequate, actually, although they do seem to have a lot of usefulness to begin processes. But then as time goes on, they need to be, worked on and worked out. So one of the first publications on just transitions in South Africa was a book by Mark Swilling and Eve Anneke, and it picked up on the socio-technical transitions and started to raise questions of justice and how that plays out in a context like ours, which I introduced a bit earlier. And then there's also a lot of challenges with this concept of just transitions, because what we're seeing, particularly from academia, actually, is a dehistoricizing of the concept of just transitions. And then in the policy space, we're seeing an appropriation of the concept of just transitions. And so we're getting increasing discourse reality gaps emerging. And what we're seeing there is a failure, basically, to embrace the complex and the multifaceted reality of just transitions as a living concept. And its origins and meanings actually come from the everyday experiences of workers and frontline communities. So it comes out of unions and movements, and it's become a very sort of strong policy concept now. And I want to talk a bit about the transition that occurs when that happens. And one of the ironies for us at the moment is that we've received this huge amount of money from the World Bank and the IMF. It's like 8.5 billion, and it's driving an enormous program in the country at the moment. And then one of the recommendations is actually to, reduce the control of labor relations management, so to loosen up your labor relations, which is an irony, because the whole just transition was produced out of the workers' movement, and with the neoliberal kind of coming in of new forms of structural adjustment, we're getting kind of almost contradictions emerging in the discourse of just transition. So here's a nice little map of the evolution of the just energy transition, starting from the unionism, early 50s, social environmentalism, into the unions, and into the international structures, and now into global and transversal structures that is now busy kind of producing the discourse of just transition, and it's a post-union type of a discourse. So, and then what we're now having to do here is to start again really asking, where is the worker, where are the women, and where are the unemployed youth, and how are they being engaged in the just transition, how are they being included in the just transition? So these are the kinds of, like, you must get like reversals or something that happens, that you lose something as these kind of transformations and transitions occur. And so that takes us then into, how justice is being described in the just transition. And we have a new framework, and it draws its discourse from actually adaptations of Nancy Fraser's theory of justice. So distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice comes directly from Nancy Fraser's theory of justice. But what begins to happen with it as it goes into the policy arena is that it also starts to lose its original intentions and its original meanings. But what this does do is it does bring to the fore the point that justice must also be seen as a process and not just an outcome or a final result. And this is quite challenging. So you can see, that if you look at the dimensions of justice, there's economic, cultural, and political. And then the injustices, I think, are well known. And what we're seeing now in the just transitioning policies, we're seeing this kind of affirmative response to these justice questions, and attempts being made but at a quite a sort of broad level, to recognize the importance of thinking about these forms of justice. And then what's happening in the social movements and in the groups that are more critical, if I could call it that, of these policy trajectories, they're actually starting to ask for more transformative responses to the justice question. And of course, our country has a history of, working on those kind of transformative responses. So it's like not new for people, it's just a new struggle in a new kind of space that's going on now. So it's very interesting, the sort of inversions, I think, that one starts to find. So there's the Nancy Fraser's book, which so much of this discourse is coming from, and it's very interesting. It's very global at the moment. It's also in the World Bank and their documentation. And as they support just transitions around the world, you're getting these same concepts of justice coming in, and you're getting the same kind of pattern emerging around them. So that brings us to the question of how do you then engage with the just transition? How do you occupy the transitioning space? So there's different ways of doing that. Of course, there's status quo approaches, managerial reform approaches, there's structural reform approaches, and then there's these, what they're calling more transformative approaches. And what you'll see is a very much almost like a kind of like a split between governments and international organizations working, in this more sort of managerial reform kind of space, and the NGOs, unions, and social movements working much more towards the transformative approaches, and then also trying to challenge and get into these structural reform approaches. So this is kind of interesting, and it really raises this question of like, where do you work, And so also I've been looking at a lot of the social movement, new work on social movements. There's a lovely book that's just been published. In fact, 2 days ago it came out, or at least I got the notice on it, which is on the Environmental Justice Atlas. And it actually captures environmental justice conflicts around the world. And then Jean Martinez-Allier has just done an analysis of those conflicts in the EJ Atlas. And really what he points to is that he says that the space of transgression in just transitions lies here. It's in the power dynamics and the valuation contests in environment and development conflicts. And it really centers political ecology as a politics and a political space to be working in just transitioning. So then you can ask these kinds of questions, where and what kind of transgression is needed? How are the terms of justice defined as experienced and enacted? In other words, not just rhetorically. And then where does this bring one into relationship with workers, women, unemployed youth, and the environment itself? So these are the questions we've been working with, and then thinking about what Martinez-Allier says. He says that we need to surface the voices of the Zadistas, Zapatistas, feminists, and ecofeminists, indigenous people, the youth of Fridays for Future, the peasants, the workers, trade unions, neighbors and citizens, environmental justice organizations, and the radicalized ecological scientists. So, the sort of story, I guess, is not a new story. It just seems to be a new struggle with a new frontier, actually. But we have a lot to learn, actually, from movements. And I think this is a very interesting space also to be thinking. And of course, there's different movements, so they're not all the same and they don't all have the same interests. But there is also an intersectionality between them. And particularly this intersectionality starts to show itself up a lot when you get into the sort of really tough spaces where the environmental degradation is quite severe. So Martinez-Allier also talks about the notion of the transgression limit, or at least I was reading his work like that. The transgression limit seems to be, or the boundary space seems to be centering itself around networked activism against the transnational extractivism in its, if you were to really look at it fully, that seems to be the space where you're going to get these sort of limit boundaries, and where you will then begin to be able to start thinking transgression and transgressive movements and so on. So, and it's really a kind of an emerging sort of split, if I could call it, between the ecological modernization system and a system of people who feel or realize that we can't go on doing the same thing, but just in a different kind of way. It actually needs a very different kind of response. So if you read those literatures, you'll see that. So this then takes me into the notion of transgressions and to think a bit more with transgression. Check my time, think I'm doing okay. And I think that one of the things that we are facing is that is these sort of periods of instability and complexity, and when things are becoming more and more difficult to work out. And so then you get, periods where you start to see forcing of authority and tradition, and also intellectual traditions. So I was thinking a lot about the transgression and the intellectual traditions of transgression. And I was thinking, how are they looking now here, and how do they look when you are thinking about something like a woman who's collecting acid mine drainage for household water? And if you get into that kind of a way of thinking about these intellectual traditions, you start to think about them differently. So, it takes me to some of the work, which I think is fairly transgressive, coming from the Global South. For example, this work on justice against epistemicide. Also, D'Souza Santos' work about the end of the cognitive empire. In other words, it's not only about producing theories, it's actually about the theories and how they're living in the world at this point. And I guess that's always been the work of good theory. So it takes us to ask what kind of theory is going to be helpful to us. Achille Mbembe's necropolitics, of course, is also a very visceral piece of work, which takes us to ask, about how governments are assigning value to life and so on. And that takes you right into the same kinds of questions that we're looking at here. And there's a lot of work on transgression. I'm not an expert on it at all, I must say, but I found this little book very useful from Chris Jenks. He talks about transgression. He does a good review of it, actually, especially the modern system of transgressive thinking. And he talks about it as going beyond the bounds or limits set by a commandment or a law or convention. He talks about it as a deeply reflexive act of denial and affirmation, a zone of attraction about margins and their relation to totalities, and transgression being something that is that conduct which breaks rules or exceeds boundaries. And then also that transgressions are manifestly situation specific and very considerably and located across social space and through time. So that in a way also brings to the surface, how does this particular transition that we're talking about, what kinds of transgressions is it bringing to the fore, and where and when and for whom, I guess, that kind of a question. So as I said, I'm not an expert on transgression theory at all, and there's a whole loads of it, I have to say, which is very nice to read. I've read a lot of it, and much of it is sort of produced, I think, mostly in the postmodern period, the works of Bataille, Foucault, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Nietzsche. And I love this quote from Pafanus, who says, "At the end of history, the transgressive laughs, the mad walk free, the silent speak, and the dead live." And I think that's a bit much the spirit of what that work is doing and doing for us in the world. And its dominance seems to be mostly in the Western avant-garde kind of space. I stand to be corrected. And it seems to attract very much work around radical aesthetics. And we've seen it being taken up very strongly in cultural studies, languages, arts, gender studies, and even architecture. I read a really nice book on transgression and architecture, which was fascinating, actually. It's really very interesting. So I'm sure that many of you are much more familiar with this than I am. And then there's this very famous quote by Foucault, which I really love. I think it's a very expressive way of talking about transgression. And he says that perhaps transgression is like a flash of lightning in the night, which from the beginning of time gives the dense and black intensity to the night it denies, which lights up the night from the inside, from top to bottom, yet owes to the dark the stark clarity of its manifestation, its harrowing and poised singularity. So there's just so much in this particular quote, and I've been reading it like for years now, and I think about it so often. And every time there's a storm, I think about this particular quote. And of course, there's a work also that brings Foucault, who wrote about Bataille's work after his death, as far as I can gather, and talking about transgression. He picks up on the theme. He says transgression is not oppositional, disruptive, or transformational. Transgression is neither violence in a divided world, in an ethical world, nor a victory over limits in a dialectical or revolutionary world. Transgression announces limitation and it's obvious. So I think that's very interesting, because for us in this sort of movement to sustainability, what is the limitation, and where are these boundaries? Where do we see them, and how do we see them is another kind of complex question. So, and then he also goes on and talks about the work of Bataille's work around taboo, and that transgression does not deny the taboo, but it transcends it and it completes it. So the relation between taboo and transgression is as a dynamic component in the process of cultural reproduction. It enables change while at the same time ensuring stability. So this kind of complex relationship between change and stability is very interesting. One of my colleagues told me once it was like the movie strip, you keep moving it and changing it, and then you think it's different, and then it's the same. So it's that kind of complex space that this concept opens up for us. But I think it's a very useful concept, because it does break you a little bit away from stasis, and the determinacy of social structures. And then it opens up a space to think about innovation and agency that is inherent in the practice of social action. And of course, if we are going to move to sustainable societies that are just, then that kind of innovation and agency in the practice of social action is crucial, and it's crucial to understand better. There's also the work of Bakhtin and Nietzsche, and they take more performance-orientated way of thinking about transgression. They locate the resources for transgression within the permissive realm of aesthetics, theatrical art, ritual, everyday performance. And of course, Bakhtin's work is famous for the carnivalesque work and the invitation to play and to, break down the binaries between mind and body and so on, So, and then of course, this has been taken up quite a lot by a number of climate activists. You can see the picture at the bottom here. They're using this strategy a lot. It's also a strategy that's used in some of the more sort of recent anarchist social movements, Seattle and others. So it's a very important strategy for, producing possibility for transgression, I think. And I'm finding that quite a number of our students actually really want to work in this particular space, because it allows them the space to just really trouble something quite quickly. And it's quite performative, so it has quite a big, if you can call it, rapid reaction. And so I was looking also at this book, which is a book by Christine Faust on transgression as a mode of resistance. And she talks about the significance of enactments. And these are material acts and gestures. And they also, just do the same kind of work. It's as was shown in the previous image there. And so this sort of unique combination of mediation and the immediate, which is a sort of, she calls it a hybrid immediacy, which that enactment allows you then to play tricks with traditional politics. So it's a very kind of powerful tool, also used quite strongly in our student movement that we recently had, the Peace Must Fall. And so this then kind of centers agency actually as the driving force for social change, and it starts to create a space for thinking agency and the uniqueness and the contingency of transgressions, okay, as well as the risks associated with them. So this is a very nice book. I liked it a lot. And then Tourain's work as well. He also speaks to transgression in his work on social movements, and also the same kind of opening, trying to think about resistors must view themselves as the generators of social change. And that is actually a collective endeavor for him, but it's not a process of building commonality. And I think this is important. In other words, it's not a reduction of the possibility of collective transgressive agency, but it is the necessarily collective for me is also very important, especially in the context where we find ourselves, which I'll share with you just now. So what you're seeing then is this broad spectrum of transgression, which is coming from blends and supports hegemonic action, and then it also is quite sort of differently radical and performative and so on in its constitution. And also this is also from the Faust book. So there's these material dimensions of transgressive enactments, and I think that that's very important also for the types of challenges that we're dealing with in the environmental sphere, this social, ecological, political, ecological sphere, and that we need this shift from rhetorical agent to agency, and then how that then can reinvigorate the modes of resistance and different forms of these modes of resistance. So they can be organizational, they can be individual, they can be mediated, they can be immediate, they can be transformative, and they can be transgressive in different ways. So we've also started to see in our research that these forms of modes of resistance, they take very different forms. So some of them are more strongly mediated and carefully mediated. Others are much more in this more immediate performative kind of approach and way of working. So here, what this then does also is it starts to change the nature of scholarship. And so our students here are talking a lot about scholar activism. They talk about it pretty much all of the time now. And because what they're doing is they're trying to create scholarly work which allows this kind of transgressive movement, and they're doing it in different ways. So here's a very beautiful example of a huge project that one of my former PhD students and just now been a colleague for the last 5 years has been developing this practice called empatheater, which is a transgressive theater practice. And it's quite incredible the amount of impact that they had also into the policy sphere, but equally into the civil society and other social spheres, most often because they also mix up the engagements with different actors from these different spheres. So scholarship then becomes an activity of transformative agency or aesthetic or transgressive engagement, and it requires then different methodologies and all sorts of things, which I'll also share a little bit on just now. So how then is this kind of discourse making its way into Africa? Well, it is, and it's making its way into, for example, here in this work, by Sefa Day, he does a book on transgressive pedagogy as pursuit of decolonial agency, resistance, and subjective politics. And he talks about transgressing normalized, domesticated, and dominating colonial and neo-colonial relations and knowledge structures. And Lewis Gordon does something very similar. He talks about the decolonization of knowledge and norms, and he asks for transgressive acts and movements in the everyday. And his piece here, he talks about a famous piece about disciplinary decadence, so every academic, every teacher should practice disciplinary decadence. It's a very sort of subtle kind of form of that type of transgression. In the art world, we've also seen, this is a book that's been published in South Africa called Acts of Transgression, and it's capturing some of the most amazing new forms of art that are emerging: street art, theater productions, music, unbelievably creative work. And what this work is doing is looking for a corporeal vocabulary of seepage and excess to articulate the distension of the time, and particularly the overwhelming onslaught on the Black body by continued economic and psychic oppression. And so they're trying to find a new language that resists narratives of certainty and linearity through which the neo-colonial agenda has been perpetuated, because even though the independence occurred in most African countries, the neo-colonial agenda has been perpetuated and continues to be perpetuated, including through the sustainability transition, as I was pointing out a bit earlier. And this is the most fascinating concept for me. The meaning of transgression actually is also a biophysical earth system concept, and it's an earth system concept that expresses or describes sea level rise. And you can see here this is the West African coast. This other picture at the bottom here is Durban in South Africa. And so what we're seeing all along our coastlines now is this incredible erosion, coastal erosion and transgression, as climate change begins to impact along the coasts and taking away whole cities and places that people are living. So this is another kind of, it's a sort of like a very grounding concept of transgression. And it always brings me back to, the environmental crisis and what we're trying to do in relation to that through the work that we do in our research center. So we've been working on, what are the boundaries that we're wanting to transgress here in our research center and in the work that we're doing. And it's really, I love this piece. It says that, we've got, in order to transgress or draw boundaries, you need to know what the constitution of the center is, right? Because the center then is the social structure, and that is then marked out by boundaries. And so one needs to do the work of conceptualizing the center and the structure that it maintains, and then also the processes by which the center becomes known. And it's for that reason that I kind of shared with you the issues that are going on when we're conceptualizing the sustainability transition and the appropriations of the concepts of justice and so on, because that in a way is showing you how the center is shifting into the discourse of the sustainability transition. And so one needs to be able to work there in order to find the boundaries, in order to think about where to work. Hence also I drew into that work of Martinez Alier. So this is a paper that I wrote with Njaru and Dylan, two scholars that I've been working on for a long time now on this T-learning program. And we were asking what it means to transgress the limits of a neoliberal world and its crisis times, particularly considering transgressions in the service of a decolonial future. And by a decolonial future, we mean a decolonial sustainable future as well. So that's in a way the boundary that we're trying to work on in our work. This is also very useful for thinking about transgressive research. It's a little book on transgression and its limits. And what I really like about it is that it sort of opens up the point that you can't predetermine actually where transgression is going to occur. It's an open process of learning what is not yet there. So you always have to be open to what is not yet there. And then also raises the point that one shouldn't use transgression in the form of hype, or to create allure or hype, because then you've already failed the actual meaning of transgression. So these are very useful to take care in the way in which one works with this kind of a concept in an educational research program, particularly. And he also raises the point about pseudo-transgression and what constitutes transgression in the real. And he talks about it as being a difficult fault line to map or to trace. But he says it's our only tool to assist in denoting empty transgression against transgression that affects the real. And so I've got this little picture here of this, woman and a child and their water tank and the whole energy story. And I guess the point is that if the transgressions are not going to work in such a way that these solar panels come to support her life better, then I guess we're heading, we're not quite doing what is possible to do, put it that way. And so we need to keep an eye on these, what I would call appropriations or narrowings of the concept of justice in something like the just transition. So to come back to T-learning, and I've got another 10 minutes, so I should be fine. To come back to T-learning in times of climate change, I'll just share with you now a little bit more of the work we've been trying to do actually in our research program, which is an educational research program. And for this work, I really liked also the work of Sheila Jasanoff. She talks about a humble approach to energy futures. And what she does is she kind of says that, so much of the discourse is about this linear narrative, like A is the current state and D is the SDG perfect state, and we're heading in that direction, and we just have to find the right leverage points and we're all going to be fine. And so she encouraged us to be more humble and to think about more complex and uncertain relationships, and then also to recognize that we're not going to solve the world's energy problems if we don't transform the ways that we look at the problem. So she actually asks us to, think differently and start in different places. And this is such a typical kind of narrative. You see, it's a sort of like similar version to the Heils model that I showed you earlier, but it's now the SDG pathway. And it sort of gives this kind of like, this is how change is going to happen, and blah, 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 blah. It's also got this temporality frame. It's got forms of transformation and so on. So it's so typical, this kind of a type of an image. But the thing is that the reality is not showing that that's actually happening. In fact, in spite of having so much new environmental law over the last 4 decades, we've had a 38-fold increase since 1972. We are still having adverse environmental changes. And in fact, the situation is not actually getting much better at all. Even the most recent Global Sustainable Development Report shows that with all this aspiration for these sort of transformative movements, those movements are not actually happening. In fact, we're getting reversals. So I think at times we're looking in the wrong place and also trying to start our work in ways that are perhaps, as Sheila said, using the wrong ways of thinking about the transformation. And what's really interesting to me is that people describe this problem now as a learning crisis. And they say that we don't have enough systems thinking. If we've got more systems thinking, we're going to have, this model is going to work better. And while I've got nothing against systems thinking, and I do understand, I know that it is really important, and I would never not teach systems thinking. I just think that to think the answer is going to lie in increasing systems thinking is not nearly enough of what needs to be done. So in addition to that, I would ask, do we need more transgressive learning that can transgress and expand our boundaries of political ecology, time and space? So a different kind of question when people are talking about the learning crisis. And one wonders whose learning is in crisis here, actually. So if you look at the energy transition, it's unprecedented in both scale and speed, even the way it's emerged, since the 1930s. The use of coal, oil, gas, you can see it coming here. And now we've got this little green thing at the top here, which is renewables, and we're trying to literally transform the entire system with these renewables, and we're supposed to do it by 2050. And they're using these policy system style instruments as being the strong force for that. And it feels to me like that is not enough. And this little picture shows us that actually by 2050, we're only going to get halfway there if we're lucky, type of a thing. So, yeah. And then when you get onto the ground where we work, this is the energy story here. This is women that are walking miles and miles and miles. They're cutting branches of trees. They're carrying them on their back. They're making charcoal, and they're selling these charcoals for, €2 per bag. And that's what they cook their food on, and that's how they have to live. So there's something completely skew in the way that this whole system is being thought through and set up. So we've been working a lot on this learning agency and trying to think about, it's more to it than knowledge. And so we have to think about the knowledge action gap. We have to think about how these activity systems are related, what the transgressions are, what kinds of learning are needed. And we started this work, early on, looking mainly into change-orientated learning and sustainability practices, and always working with, women, farmers, fishers, community foresters, workers, beekeepers, children, teachers, local government officials, and, trying to see what the realities are for them, and then think from there outwards into this bigger world of policy. And so since those early days, we've started to enrich this program a lot with, a range of different theories, including the social movement literature, reconstructive social theory, transgression theory. We've looked at multi-level transition theory, Bascar's laminated totality, and really trying to find tools to do this work. And we don't find them in one place. We find them in many places. We've also worked a lot with the post-Freirean work, also African liberatory pedagogy, Bell Hooks' work, feminist decolonial theory. So to do this work, it seems like one needs to be able to draw from what seems useful in the context, and try to make sense of it in relation to the kinds of challenges that we're sitting with. And we took the gap in 2014 when the ICC advertised for that Transformations to Sustainability program. And we found this statement in the IPCC report, which talked about that learning was important for climate change response, but not enough was known about the type of learning that we needed for this response. And so we started to amplify, if I could call it that, this T-learning research project. And then we decided to locate it in ordinary lives. And I really like this quote from Pavanelli. She says that to avoid regress into liberal utopias, she proposes that potentiality is the refuge not of the hopeful, but of the concretely ordinary and pragmatically banal, where a form of cruel yet possible optimism exists as the norm for acting in the conditions and the geographies that characterize most ordinary lives. And that opened up for us, agency from below, agency of just everyday people everywhere. And so we did all these case studies, large number of case studies now. These are I'll just flash them to you. This is a case study in Ethiopia, working with people around sacred natural sites. This is a case study of working with a woman on the edges of Lake Malawi, where they constantly faced with recurring drought and challenges there, and then struggling with food security. This is in Zimbabwe, also dealing with recurring droughts and, of course, failing economic systems, failing political systems. This one is working with farmers who got back their land and they didn't have any water. They got the land back with no water and had to produce food. This one is the toxic mine dumps outside the northern part of our country where we're mining coal, and the acid mine drainage and heavy levels of pollution, working with communities there. This one is working with mine-affected communities who were losing their land, and with drug users in the inner cities. And this one was working with the students during the Fees Must Fall and after, trying to understand the rising youth cultures. This one was in Colombia, looking at eco-village practices and the knowledges of people that have been oppressed. This one is in Vietnam, working with so-called scientific farmers. So the scientists working with the farmers to try to adapt to the rising rivers and so on in that area. And so on, So what we've sort of come to is to say that this T-learning is actually a politics of and for life, is a source for T-learning. That's where it comes from. That's where we find it, and that's where it's needed. And it relates to Dussell's concept of a politics of potential, that kind of a concept. And really, it's a politics of and for life, not only for us, but also for the fish and the fishing ecosystems. This is a community in Zambia that we were working with. And so on, So in just sort of trying to pull together some of this, I think the one kind of thing we've learned is that this T-learning processes, they need like sort of tender care, actually. And they need depth and careful work, colonial, decolonial critical work to reveal the powers and then to unleash the dynamism of people's cultures. And so that brings us to the need for cognitive justice and to giving space to people's languages, their cultures, their senses, their ways of making meaning. It's multidimensional, it's multimodal, it's not in one mode at all. This process of tracing the center and then finding the absences, the boundaries, testing the limits, transgressing the unsustainable, the border crossing work, being open to transgression, all of this is very important. And there's hard work of unlearning and then learning and then relearning. And then it requires this mode of research that's more generative, not necessarily generalizable. And that research also comes with this transformative activist stance approach. And I think this one I put up here, especially for Michelle, because it's not linear, we've discovered as well. And there are these pulses that happen. So people, we tend to use a sort of expansive learning framework in a broad sense, and then we tend to follow the way that the learning processes unfold over time, and sometimes 3 to 5 years. We work with groups of people and then look at what's going on. So, and this is such an incredible pattern. We often see people start implementing something, and then there's implementation and resistance, implementation and resistance, implementation and remodeling, and then reviewing, and then suddenly something breaks through. And that's where the transformative agency, the collective transformative agency, actually breaks through, and then that continues. And we found years afterwards, people still working on these processes as a result of these supported transformative learning processes that we've worked on catalyzing. And when I say we, I'm talking about all of the scholars in our research center that are working in communities on these kinds of challenges. Here's a beautiful story. This is the one from Malawi. Incredible transgression that occurred there, which was a gender-based transgression, but also recognized the knowledge of the women, and they were able to produce food in far better quantities than what the extension services and all the men in the community were telling them. Simple thing, but enormously powerful. And so we've tried to also, try to find different ways of representing this kind of learning, looking at it as here's a beautiful drawing by Dylan. He drew it as a sort of plant spiraling out with, roots and shoots and stems and leaves and blossoms and flowers, and that there's absences and there's moments and there's processes and there's barriers. And I think it would be really nice to work with Michelle on, the rhythm aspects of this kind of work. And so we've also been trying to just work it out slowly. And it's so interesting because academia always wants you to be fast, and they want you to produce publications all the time. And one of the things I've been unable to do actually is to produce many publications from this work. I've done a few, which I'm happy to share with you, but I still haven't done the substantive system of publishing for this work. And it's because it actually needs this careful time to really fully try to get to grips with what it is that is happening here. So we've looked at across the literatures and, looking at dialectics. I like this piece from Van der Berg. He's a critical realist, and he writes, when dialogue shifts out into dialectics, it becomes transgressive. And that seems to me something that is happening. And then there's this work of Santos. He talks about the double transgression of absence and emergence. So the first transgression is that there's absence. In other words, it's just not there or not attended to. And then the second transgression is the emergence, the transgression to produce an emergence of what is needed or what is wanted by people. And of course, the normative, critical, and action-orientated, Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, that kind of work also. So we've done a lot of work trying to think about these differentiations and what they look like. It took us like maybe 5 years to come to this, which was to try to differentiate between transformative learning coming out of the main literatures and then how it relates to our field, transgressive learning, transdisciplinary learning, together learning. We found there was a lot of work on collective learning, a lot of work on transdisciplinary learning, a lot of work on transformative learning, much less on transgressive learning. And then we also wanted to frame it so that it resonated with the type of practice that we're working with. So we, in the end, called it, we said that it's explicitly challenged, taken for granted, normalized practices, activity, cultures, views, and systems that have become oppressive, that are discriminatory and unsustainable, and to do that with critique, empathy, care, possibility, knowledge, reflexivity, and regenerative sensibilities. So that's kind of the best that we've got to so far in, trying to frame our meaning of this particular concept. And I guess what we're also seeing is it's really part of a shift in theory from hypercritique to transgressive and regenerative forms of social and learning theory, and the significance of collectives and their role in society. I think we're also seeing that. And then just to go back to Fanon, who said it's from our action and struggle that questions arise. And what needs to emerge is a new language of learning that supports social movement and action. And I think in these times is what we're trying to kind of add to that. And this is my last little comment, just to come back to transitions and transgression. I love this quote. It's from Nigel Gibson, who's a Fanon scholar. And he writes about the Abahlali shack dwellers movement. He works a lot with them. And then he talks about their learning programs that they were working on, that they work on. And he said that Abahlali was determined to make sure that whatever was learned outside the shacks in schools and university courses is judged against the lived experiences of the people in the shacks. And for me, that provides, the humble starting point for thinking about tea learning in just transitions. So that's my offering for today. Thank you. I think I'm just about on time. Thank you.